from his Prime Minister and from no one else.
I've terminated your commission. We shall all have to live with this. You certainly will.
I know what price I paid for what I did. I have no regrets about what I did because it was right.
Here is a news flash from the ABC newsroom. The Prime Minister, Mr. Whitlam, has been dismissed from office. The Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, has just announced that he has terminated Mr. Whitlam's commission. The opposition leader, Mr. Fraser, has been asked to form a caretaker government until an election can be held.
Proclamation by His Excellency the Governor-General of Australia.
It's 12 years ago today since Australians tasted the bitterness of what we've come to call the dismissal. The action that day on Parliament House steps revealed just how dangerously fragile are the contents of our Constitution. On that day, our remaining ties with Great Britain seemed ready to break.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
While few have maintained their rage against Sir John Kerr, his public life after the sacking of Gough Whitlam has never been the same.
In this 25th Jubilee year of Her Majesty's reign, that she has graciously been pleased to agree that this...
For the last 2 years that were left to Sir John Kerr as Governor-General, his public appearances were marked more by shouts of abuse than by votes of thanks. Stoic, almost contemptuous of the lingering criticism of his actions, Sir John Kerr retired and slipped out of the public eye. Now, 10 years later, in this rare interview, Sir John Kerr talks with international barrister and broadcaster Geoffrey Robertson about some of the constitutional issues that were central to the Whitlam dismissal.
Sir John, the Australian Constitution, in some respects, is a sketchy document. It relies upon conventions. It doesn't codify. It doesn't set out clearly, for example, the reserve powers of the Governor-General. Do you think there's a case for codifying those, for stating them?
Well, this problem has been with us in Australia for many years, and it was discussed in some detail by Dr. Evatt.
Dr. Evatt was in favour of codifying them, as I recall.
He was indeed, yes. And ever since Evatt's book, it has been a subject of discussion as to whether these conventions, which control the exercise of the reserve powers of the Governor-General, should be codified, written down as law.
One consequence, of course, of not having them codified is the need for a lawyer, more recently the need for a constitutional lawyer as Governor-General. Because if a crisis occurs, if a situation occurs where reserve powers have to be exercised, it's thought right that the Governor-General should be a lawyer capable of deciding what the reserve power is, the scope of it.
When you say it is thought desirable, who are you talking about?
Well, the point of view has been expressed in the appointment of Sir Zalman Khan and the appointment of Sir Ninian Stephen, both great lawyers, to that position.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't someone who's a distinguished scientist or a respected author...
Why do you limit it to Sir Ninian and Sir Zalman? There's a much more dramatic example of it, namely myself.
Indeed.
There have been three of us lately.
Indeed, but you were not a constitutional expert at the time, and that was why you said that you felt it necessary to seek the advice of Sir Garfield Barwick, which was itself a...
No, that is not true. I was certainly not a regular practitioner in constitutional cases in the High Court. But I was a lawyer and a judge and the Chief Justice of New South Wales. And I had no doubt about my ability to answer the question for myself.
Why then was it necessary?
I did answer it for myself. But I wanted the comfort and reassurance of other opinions. and I got Barwick's.
If we codify the reserve powers, if we make them clear, then there's no need to have a lawyer in that job. We can appoint a respected scientist, a respected artist or writer to be Governor-General.
I'd be happy to see any person capable of neutrality and any person intelligent enough, if he doesn't himself understand the particular problem, to get advice from people
from a
whom
neutral
he
source.
believes, not necessarily from a neutral source, from anyone that he believes could help him.
But shouldn't the advice procedure be one of going to the High Court, the full High Court, for an advisory opinion and not just to X or Y or Z?
I don't think so. I don't think so. What is done in the exercise of the reserve powers is to make a political decision. A political decision of a very important kind.
Certainly.
It will perhaps offend certain people in the community.
And it will favour certain
And it
people
will,
in the
of
community.
course, some people in the community will regard themselves as having had a success,
Yes.
others as having had a loss. And this may cause bitterness. But on the other hand, I'm no subscriber to the views that judges acting judicially are necessarily the persons to decide important political questions.
Isn't it an argument, a strong argument, for codifying the reserve powers, for writing them down so we know where we are?
I'm not in favour of that because you're dealing with a whole range of human affairs, and it is not possible, in my opinion, to codify them. But doubtless some attempts will be made, and then we'll see how it works if they go on with such an amendment.
A convention is only a convention if people in public life observe it.
That is correct, and indeed, I think myself, conventions in the constitutional field, to exist at all, must have a basis of cross-party support.
You, as Governor-General, if you are, rely upon people in public office to act according to convention.
That was part of what was involved in 1975, of course.
Of course, and one of the things that strikes me as being most obvious breach of any convention was the decision not to appoint a member of the Labour Party to a casual vacancy in the Senate. The field appointment, in other words.
Oh, yes, I know what you're talking about, but I think that...
But wasn't that a breach of an understood convention? The first breach, in fact, of that year?
Well, I think it is doubtful whether that convention had actually been established.
Where you have people like the Premier of Queensland who are prepared to break conventions for political advantage, isn't that a strong argument for writing down conventions in a new constitution?
It's a strong argument. It is an argument without any doubt. But there are countervailing arguments and countervailing opinions.
The government in 1975 would probably never have reached the brink and toppled over it as it did if, first of all, the convention had been applied and Labour supporters had been appointed to those Senate vacancies, if there had been a convention, as is now recommended, that the Senate doesn't block supply for 30 days, all these matters would have been clear. There would have been no room for the kind of discretion which has caused, through its exercise, so much bitterness and dismay.
Well, the bitterness and dismay is a fact of life. You see, you have plenty of bitterness.
But it could have been avoided if we'd known for sure.
You say so. Nobody knows that.
Of course, had the recommendation of the Constitutional Commission that the Senate do not have power to block supply for more than 30 days been in the Constitution in 1975, the dismissal would not have come about.
That's right. The Senate would not have... I mean, it would have denied supply for 30 days.
30
People
days.
would have waited for the 30 days.
Yes.
And then that situation would be over. I haven't worked out in my own mind what the consequences of this would be.
One development which has often been predicted, particularly as a result in 1975, was that Australia would one day become a republic. Is that something that you can foresee as inevitable?
Inevitable? Have you got a time scale on this?
Well, by the centenary, perhaps, of our Constitution?
No, I wouldn't regard that as being inevitable by the centenary of the Constitution. But, of course, in the course of history as it unfolds, who knows? It's quite possible that Australia could become a republic.
And would that be a development that you would see good arguments for?
Well, I am not a kind of natural Republican type, but if Australia wants to become a republic, it can happen. It can happen by amending the Constitution to abolish the monarchy. We would in effect lose nothing except in the field of symbolism and ceremony, tradition, and so on. The fact is that Australia now is totally free and independent and democratic in terms of its existing constitution or any future constitution.
But don't you think symbolism is important, and that to
I do. Yes.
grovel and scrape, to have the symbolism of the arcane kind of imperial honours and bobbing and curtsying and so on, isn't that something that, as a mature democracy, we could well do without?
Well, there are lots of things as a mature democracy we could do without. But tradition is important in all cultures. I don't think that the amendment of the Constitution is a matter which should be handled as a kind of bicentennial show or as a bicentennial monument-producing activity.
Many people think that the right to protest, the right of free speech, the right to a speedy and fair trial are not sufficiently guaranteed in our constitutional arrangements. There are suggestions coming from the Constitutional Commission and its sections that indeed there should be. Have you some sympathy with those suggestions?
I have a sympathetic approach to what the Committee on Individual and Democratic Rights has recommended to the Commission on the subject of constitutional guarantees.
What about the other suggestion that the Constitution should entrench the basic democratic value of one vote, one value?
Well, simply put, I would think that my opinion would be that filibusters are bad things, and although there ought to be some flexibility on the percentage above or below the figure which would be indicated by population, and there's a fashion nowadays to say a 10% change up or down is fair and reasonable. I must say I tend to think that myself.
Isn't that so, that more than 10% can become a gerrymander,
of course it is,
as it does in one state in particular?
I wonder what state you're talking about.
Queensland.
Yes, I thought so. Yes, I understand what you're talking about.
But that is the case. That
you can go too far, obviously.
And Queensland does.
I've always thought so, yes. But I understand the problem, and I understand the reasons why, as between rural seats and city seats, that happens.
The principles are important.
Of course they're important, yes, and that's why we're talking about it. That's why everybody's going to be debating about it next year or the year after that.
Including yourself?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a citizen now, that's all I am. It's
Citizen Kerr.
Citizen Kerr, yes. It's a very important thing to be in a country like ours, where the people have such powers. The people have powers under our Constitution to alter it themselves.
Did you watch the mini-series, The Dismissal?
Yes. I didn't watch them immediately. Of course, I was living in England.
Sure.
But I did see it, yes.
What did you think of John Million, I think, played you?
What did you think of it?
Well, I thought he played you as a somewhat out-of-touch, over-liquored representative who was allowed himself to produce a situation, perhaps unconsciously, in which he became the captive of one political party.
Well, I didn't get that impression myself.
What impression did you get?
I've heard various opinions about how he handled the matter, and I've heard opinions about how other actors handled other aspects of it. But it is so divorced from reality that it's very difficult for me to talk about it.
You did not connect the portrayal with the events that you lived through.
Certainly not.
You were to suffer perhaps among the worst vilification of anyone in Australian history. You never thought that the principles that you defended then were a little too broad, a little too favourable to the press?
No, I didn't think it then, and I don't think it now.
But as
to what happened to me, of course, they were very unusual circumstances.
Yes, but as a public man, having made a public decision, you felt that it was the right of people to vilify you in no uncertain terms.
No, the right to vilify me. I think it was very wrong, a lot of what was done, morally speaking. As to the legal aspects of it, that's a different matter. You see, there are many considerations to be taken into account before a person in my position, as it then was, would submit any aspect of those goings-on himself to the processes of litigation.
You never thought of suing for libel?
I often thought about it, the proceeds that may have been able to be reached in the way of donations to funds mine.
Yes.
But I didn't, no, I didn't ever think, I didn't consider it seriously.
Do you think, in fact, the libel laws perhaps protect public figures who are not as reticent about suing as you were?
Well, in some countries there's more of that approach in the law. But I haven't myself given close thought in modern days to the way in which the libel laws are used. I think different people respond differently.
It's often surprised me that given the virulence of the attacks on you and the availability of the libel law in Australia to public figures that you never did take legal action.
One reason is that I do not think that the courts are the place for those issues to be decided in relation to aspects of the events of 1975. I didn't ever want to take anything to the courts myself.
It would have meant submitting it to a jury.
Well, it would have meant submitting it to a jury, and of course to any tribunal would possibly be affected one way or the other, unconsciously, by the cataclysmic nature of the controversy and the issues.
Yes.
And it was better, I thought, to leave the thing to the ultimate judgment of history.
Don't you wish sometimes that 1975 had been the year of the Kerr dismissal rather than the year of the Whitlam dismissal?
There was no possibility of that unless the Prime Minister summoned up the decision-making capacity to make that decision, and he had the decision to make.
But wouldn't that have been the right way to go about it, to put the Prime Minister in the position of deciding whether to sack you and live with that, or whether to go to the people?
Do you mean some constitutional amendment that would produce that situation?
No, I mean that in 1975, before November the 11th, weren't you in a position to advise and to warn the Prime Minister that, in your honest view, you would have to produce a double dissolution on November the 11th?
He knew that.
He says he didn't.
Well,
and there is nothing in writing.
Pretty poor Prime Minister if he didn't know that that was one of the real risks.
But why should it be a risk? Why should it not have been known by him, by the leader of the opposition, by the people, that that was in your mind, and that that, in fact, was your decision?
Two people had powers relevant to the situation. I had the power to dismiss him, and he had the power to dismiss me.
Mm-hmm.
And, in fact, that situation was resolved on the 11th of November, when his only reaction to the information that I gave him, that I had decided to withdraw his commission, was to, by direct implication, say, I'll have to get in touch with the palace to prevent that.
But the proper democratic situation would be for the Prime Minister to decide whether to dismiss you and then live with that because he's answerable to the people, rather than for the Governor-General to decide to dismiss the Prime Minister because the Governor-General isn't answerable to the people.
Well, the point is that the people have a constitution which gives this power as a reserve power to the Governor-General, so that the Governor-General has the power, and it's a question whether the circumstances are such to justify its use.
But the thing that still shrouds the decision of 1975 was the clandestinity in which it was conducted. And if it were ever, if a similar situation were ever to happen again, would you not expect a Governor-General to make crystal clear to the Prime Minister what he proposed to do, and let the Prime Minister, as the elected representative, decide whether to take the dramatic action of dismissing the Governor-General, or whether to go to the people as Prime Minister?
You've got to realise that Mr. Whitlam, at this time, was himself openly and continuously following a policy which he enunciated.
So was Mr. Fraser.
Yeah, that's right, but he was the Prime Minister, and he enunciated a policy which he never shifted from. Mm-hmm. He enunciated it in Goulburn on the 12th of September. His principle was that the Senate should be smashed and destroyed.
But he was entitled, as Prime Minister, to follow that policy.
Well, he was entitled to follow the policy with the consequences involved, because he himself was in breach of one of the strongest conventions that exists, namely that if the supply is denied by either House of Parliament, each having the power to deny it, then he should go to an election.
But a stronger convention is that the Governor-General must advise and must warn. And surely...
No, there's no such convention. The Governor-General must advise and must warn.
Do you not think it more
He has the right to advise.
Do you not think it more satisfactory? Do you not think that the whole bitterness and anger that's erupted, that's made you a leper in your own land?
Well, thank you for that observation.
But it's true, is it not?
No, it's not. Absolutely.
That you're not invited to functions, even still, 13 years afterwards.
Look, Geoffrey, this is a very, very delicate matter that you're now entering into. I know what price I paid for what I did. I have no regrets about what I did because it was right. In the same circumstances, which were very special and unusual, I would do the same thing, with all the consequences involved.
What I believe is that the criticism that still lingers, the bitterness that still lingers, would not be there if you were to accept that you might perhaps have done it more openly.
Well, it would have been impossible to do it openly, more openly, and stay there.
Yes.
That's right. Well, there was much more at stake in that decision.
But
You seem to realise.
But personally, of course, there was much at stake, and a sense, I suppose, of propriety. You would have felt that it would be outrageous for a Prime Minister to sack a Governor-General.
I wouldn't think it would be outrageous. It would depend on the circumstances. It is a power that he has.
Well, at the end of the day, I simply wanted to ask you whether you do not feel that you would be happier and the country happier had it been the Kerr dismissal rather than the Whitlam dismissal.
It's not a question of being happier. If one in an office like this set as one of the elements in the decision-making process one's own happiness, things would be entirely different.
But the country's happiness?
Well, the country's happiness, the country has to live with the conflicts and differences of opinion that emerge in politics. Now, let's leave it at that.
Sir John, let's leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Next week, the theme will be music, and in particular, new Australian composers, including Peter Sculthorpe, when Helen Wellings takes time out to investigate Talking Shop, next Wednesday at 10:45. Stay with ABC Now as Penelope Keith stars in Sweet 16.